Thank you for joining this webinar of Leveraging Networked Improvement Communities to Improve Student Outcomes, sponsored by the Regional Educational Laboratories Midwest. This meeting is being recorded. For your information, the American Institute for Research allows for recording of audio, visuals, participants, and other information sent, verbalized, or utilized during these types of meetings. By joining a meeting, you do automatically consent to this recording. Any participant who prefers to participate via audio only should disable their video camera so that only the audio will be captured. Video and audio recordings of any AIR session shall not be transmitted to an external third party without the explicit permission of AIR. And we are recording. We just want to take a moment to let you familiarize yourself with Zoom if you're not up to date on this platform already. To join audio, there should be a join audio button in the left-hand corner of your screen. You also have the option to dial in via phone. Click on the chat box to ask questions or let us know about any technical problems. We do have staff monitoring this, and we will have breaks for Q&A as we go through our presentation. Also want to let you know that we do have live closed captioning. In order to turn on closed caption, please look for the button in the right, and that'll come up on your screen. All right, welcome and hello. I am Dr. Dominique Bradley. I'm a researcher at the Regional Educational Laboratories Midwest. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Alyssa Espinoza. She's a Senior Technical Assistance Consultant at AIR, American Institutes for Research, and Dr. Courtney Rowland, Principal Technical Assistant Consultant from Regional Educational Laboratories Midwest as well. Thank you so much for joining us. And I'm happy to introduce our guest panelists, Bradley Jensen and Alyssa Prater. Bradley Jensen is a lead teacher and advisor in alternative adult education at the Empower Learning Center in the Hinkley Finlayson School District. He received his degree from the College of St. Scholastica and has been teaching for 10 years after retiring from the U.S. Air Force. Thank you so much for joining us today, Bradley. Alyssa Prater is a lead teacher and advisor for alternative learners ages 16 to 21, and she has served as a distance learning coordinator and teacher for the past 2 years at the Empower Learning Center. She earned her Master's of Education from the College of St. Scholastica after falling in love with teaching as a substitute 6th grade teacher. Alyssa, thank you so much for joining us as well. We're looking forward to speaking to both of you a little bit later in the presentation. In today's webinar, we will provide a brief overview of the Regional Educational Laboratories and REL Midwest and what we do. We'll have a discussion of how networked improvement communities operate and the tools that they use. Then we'll provide some background context about the work that we've done in Minnesota around networked improvement communities. And we'll hop into our panel discussion with our guest panelists. And then some quick closing remarks and a survey. So this webinar is sponsored by the Regional Educational Laboratories Midwest. This is one of 10 regional education laboratories, or RELs, that are funded by the Institute for Education Sciences. REL Midwest supports educational agencies and stakeholders in Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. Each of these states are supported by their own research alliances. REL Midwest does this work of supporting educational stakeholders through providing technical assistance, applied research projects, workshops, events such as this webinar, and the Ask a REL service. The work presented today is supported by the Midwest Career Readiness Research Alliance, or MCRA. Under this alliance, we have focused the work on offering support for educational agencies who really want to implement competency-based education strategies, as well as establishing 2 networked improvement communities in the state of Minnesota, which we will share with you today. Now I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Alyssa Espinoza.
Thank you so much, Dominique. So I'd like to start by talking about what is a NIC. I'd like to, we will be referring throughout the session a NIC, we call it a NIC, a Networked Improvement Community for short. They're a relatively new type of, sorry about that, I just realized that I was not on video. Okay, so going back to defining a NIC, it's a relatively new type of collaborative research partnership between researchers and educators, I would say within the last decade. And really it's about working together towards developing and testing interventions to address common problems of practice. They've become increasingly popularized by the Carnegie Foundation for Advancements of Teaching, and really a lot of funders such as the Gates Foundation, Nellie Mae Foundation have invested a significant amount of funds towards NICs. NICs can be educators working in a range of capacities at different levels of the education system, whether it be school level, district level, or state level. So why form a NIC, and what are the distinguishing features or what really makes the Nik model appealing? It is a promising approach that educators can use to tackle a range of education issues and to solutions within the local context. It empowers practitioners to take active roles in research and improvement. It's also designed to affect change across schools and systems, not just individual classrooms. It addresses immediate needs and priorities, and as we all have experienced, this is even more relevant at this moment in time due to the education inequities that have been exacerbated by the learning disruptions over the last 2 years. So whether it's SEL, whether it's attendance, discipline, or family engagement, for example, this model can be used to test strategies for addressing problems or issues as they arise in real time. Another unique advantage is that it allows for small-scale testing to inform large-scale implementation. It also supports other improvement efforts by shedding light on contextual factors that might impact program implementation across the system. Finally, NICs are designed to carry out rapid cycles of continuous improvement in real time, meaning that changes and adjustments are made along the way to increase the likelihood of achieving the intended outcomes. As described by Anthony Bright, one of America's most noted educational researchers in continuous improvement, rather than asking whether an intervention works, a network improvement community asks what works, when, for whom, and under what particular circumstances. So today I'll be covering the 4 essential features of the Nik model, and as Dominique mentioned earlier, you will have the opportunity to learn a little bit about how these all are operationalized in the Nik that we will be sharing during the panel discussion. Again, the first feature is that it is focused on a common aim. Developing an aim statement is a collective effort. It should represent individuals at all levels of the network, including practitioners, researchers, decision makers. The aim articulates the commitment that all network members agree to collectively work towards. It also serves as an overarching goal for an improvement effort that answers the key question, what are we here to accomplish? They should clearly specify for whom, how much, and by when. And it should be aspirational, but it also should be achievable. Therefore, the measures that are determined by the team are essential to keeping track as to whether those outcomes are in fact achievable and what progress is being made towards them. I've had the privilege and opportunity to be part of 3 distinct NICs over the last 5 years. I'd like to share some examples of the aims that we arrived at. The first is a NIC focused on math achievement for high school students. And as you can see, the focus is on increasing proficiency, right, for students in mathematics in both Algebra 1 and geometry. The second is focused on ELA achievement for middle school students. And the third is focused on a multidisciplinary centered student-centered formative assessment specifically for high school students. So as you can see from the 3 aims, while they're all distinct in nature, meaning that they focus on different content areas, whether it be math or ELA, or on general student formative assessment, and with it a variation, as you can see, across grade levels and variation across, again, content areas, they all equally articulate what the NIC is set out to accomplish. So throughout this session, you'll hear the term change idea quite a bit. And a change idea is an alteration to a system or process. It is tested to provide insight as to whether the intervention or change is truly impacting the identified driver for change. So I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about what is meant by a driver in reference to a networked improvement community and what we mean by working theory of improvement. So what you will see is the driver diagram, which is essentially a visual representation of a group's working theory of improvement. It establishes a common language among a diverse set of problem solvers. I'd like to share a driver diagram from the network focused on math as an example. So what I'd like to do is show you the aim statement, and this should seem familiar from the previous slide. Then I'd like to show you the primary driver. Now, the primary drivers represent an improvement community's hypothesis about the main area of influence necessary to advance the aim. Now, as you can see in this case, math instruction that provides opportunity for all students to access and engage with rigorous content is the primary driver. The secondary drivers reflect the structures or processes necessary to actualize the primary driver. So in this case, in order to ensure access with rigorous and engaging content, we're really looking to ensure that student tasks and examples balance fluency and understanding, and that students are solving, communicating, arguing, and evaluating. Then what follows are the change ideas. And as mentioned earlier, the idea is that these change ideas are alterations to existing practice. So in this specific case, we might decide that a change idea is really determining the type of question that offers opportunities for just-in-time review, as well as launching into content to introduce the lesson. So we're doing a lot of review and thinking about what those tasks look like. We may have a problem-solving template with prompts to facilitate the solving process to provide students a guide and again some scaffolds around that, and a discussion protocol in which pairs of students take turns sharing, justifying their work to help build those skills around communicating, arguing, and evaluating. The next feature is that the work is really grounded in a deep understanding of the problem. We must engage a diverse set of practitioners and researchers, as mentioned earlier, that together identify and articulate the problem. It's also essential to conduct a root cause analysis because it ensures that selected change ideas, whatever those interventions or practices are, that they're appropriately aligned to the identified root cause and that they're supported by evidence. Tools such as the fishbone diagram illustrated in this slide are helpful to unpeel the layers of the problem. This will also lead to long-term change as opposed to treating the symptoms of, let's say, a problem. In other words, we're not seeking a short-term Band-Aid improvement efforts, but really trying to dig deep in trying to understand the underlying causes of the problem. In doing so, we will identify other data sources that either confirm or further inform the problem that we have identified. So the third is that NICs are really grounded by applying improvement science methods. They are disciplined and they test and refine interventions, in this case using what we call the plan, do, study, act cycle. So as you can see, the plan, for example, when planning, the team of networked improvement doers, those that are doing the work, propose a change in how to test it. They then select their measures and they develop a data collection plan to make sure that they're tracking the progress that they're making and the impact of that particular change idea. Next is the do. So this is where the implementers go off and they test the change idea. They collect data and they reflect on what happened. We then go into the study piece, and that's where we really look to analyze and capture any information that we learned to help inform the improvements. Lastly, we act, which is based on the data collected, we decide on whether to adapt, adopt, or abandon the change idea. So it's a fast and it's an iterative cycle in which we're constantly refining as we move along. So let me give you a concrete example, going back to the previous math NIC that I mentioned earlier. So as you might recall, we talked about an aim, we talked about a primary driver. and the secondary driver. In this case, an example of one was solving, communicating, and arguing and evaluating. So if we look at an example plan, what you'll notice is that the team came together and decided what type of change idea or instructional routine will we put together to support students in solving, evaluating, and arguing. So in this case, teachers got together and thought about a particular question that would stimulate thinking, the types of instructions to give students to individually process the task at hand, and then agree on collaborative structures and discussion prompts, both in small groups, but also in the larger whole group discussions, and then determining the most effective system to really monitor the quality, but also the depth of conversations that students are having. So teachers will then go ahead and they will implement the change idea. They'll look and measure the percentage of students engaged in the small group discussions, both the number of students engaged, but also the quality of the discussions that they're engaging in, measure the percentage of students engaged in the whole group discussion, survey students regarding the learning experience, engage in individual teacher reflection, and then document any surprises or challenges that arise along the way. Next, the team would come together and they would debrief, share their data, review their individual classroom data, and capture any challenges or barriers that surfaced that is context specific, meaning the students that they specifically tested the change idea with. They look at effective approaches, what worked for you, what didn't work for others, and how do you learn from each other on the spot, right? And then come together to propose possible refinements to the implementation of the agreed upon change idea. Then we move into the act. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where the team will decide and reach consensus on, do we adapt the current idea because it shows promise? It worked in some contexts and maybe not others, but can we make adaptations so that it increases its effectiveness on most students? Or do we abandon this change idea? Do we determine that it's not really pushing on that driver that is necessary to achieve the network aim? Or should we adopt it, meaning that it's shown evidence of success and it's ready to take to scale? So the last feature of a networked improvement community, and really one of the most exciting pieces, is that it's organized to replicate change ideas across various contexts and disseminate effective practices. And this is done in a variety of different ways and at different periods of time, meaning that there are some more immediate dissemination of practices and some that are a little bit more long-term. The most immediate, of course, are the team debriefs, where classroom teachers share what worked, what did not work, and under what conditions. We also, NICs typically are a part of network convenings where all the NIC participants come together to share across classrooms, schools, districts, or states. And again, this depends on the makeup of the NIC and who's involved. There are also opportunities for publications. Oftentimes the practitioners and the researchers collaborate on broader dissemination to the field. And then there are conferences that NIC participants collaborate on, presentations to share tools, resources, and processes with other NICs across the country. Essentially, these conferences, Carnegie hosts a yearly conference where NICs from across the country come together. And again, they share tools, they problem solve together, they share exciting, promising evidence for models or change ideas that they've come up with. And I do see that the questions coming in, and I promise I will make sure that I have a couple minutes at the end so that I can address some of the questions that are coming in the chat, all very, very good questions. So the Partners for Network Improvement at the University of Pittsburgh have worked with numerous NICs across the country and often serve as developmental evaluators for funders such as Gates and the Nellie Mae Foundation. And here are some benefits that teachers have consistently reported in either interviews or surveys. Teachers are saying that peer collaboration and problem solving are powerful forms of professional development. The disciplined approach of the plan, do, study, act cycles provides accountability and supports long-term instructional change. The network design tends to break down disciplinary silos, allowing teachers to benefit from a broader array of colleagues. And this iterative use of data increases teacher confidence and ability to use data to inform instruction. And lastly, quick wins mean seeing those immediate changes in student learning increase teachers' confidence in the use and application of continuous improvement. Lastly, I will say that some implementation tips based on conversation with continuous improvement experts and feedback provided by NIC participants during debrief conversations in other NICs in Michigan and Minnesota are the following. Build a team with a diverse set of expertise, clarify those roles and commitments, establish buy-in by aligning work with ongoing efforts. We all know how difficult and how taxed educators are at all levels of the system. How do you create alignment and ensure this doesn't feel like something else that you're doing, but something that's really effective and efficient across various efforts in your school or district? And use improvement science tools resource to identify actionable problems. And this comes back to identify the problem, really looking at the root causes and addressing those root causes rather than the symptoms. We want to make sure that teachers feel like they're capable of moving the lever on those key problems that they've identified. And lastly, increase capacity to apply continuous improvement research to address problems of practice. As you heard earlier, really feeling like there's a sense of a quick win and success for teachers really helps to build their confidence in applying continuous improvement research to address the immediate problems they're working on, but really across other levels of their work. Okay, so I'd like to take the time, and I'm going to invite my colleague, Dominique Bradley, to help me in fielding some of these questions, because I know that I might have missed some of them while I was presenting. So I'm happy to address any, Dominique, at this time.
Let's start with a specific question. How many teachers were involved in the NICs that you worked on?
So it really ranged in the math NIC, for example, we had 10 high schools with teachers in algebra and geometry, and I would say that that number was just over 100 teachers. In the literacy network, we are working with 10 middle schools, teachers 6th, 7th, and 8th, both in ELA, though the focus is literacy. It's both ELA and history. And in the student-centered formative assessment NIC, we actually worked with 3 different high schools across several districts. And I would say that by the 3rd year, we were working with approximately 80 teachers.
All right, excellent, thank you. Next question, which is a great question. How will you explain in more detail how the participants would know if something worked or not?
Good question. So when we come together as a team, depending on the change idea that we're testing, and just to give you a concrete example, I mentioned that a change idea was to monitor the depth of conversations, right? So the teachers would then decide on what that measure might be. So they might have a set of indicators that they're looking for when they're walking around and listening to student conversations. It can be as simple as counting the number of students that are participating and engaging in the conversations, and then there may be it could be a range from 1 to 3 as far as the depth of conversations, the types of questions that they're asking, the way that they're arguing with each other along a particular concept. That data is determined before the change idea is tested. Teachers gather that data, and then we look at trends. So they'll reflect individually and say, I noticed that this percentage of my students participated, yet the quality of the conversations were not quite where I wanted them to be based on this set of data. And the teachers share it, and then they look to see if there are any commonalities across their experiences, and where a teacher might not have done as well as another, they talk about why and what could possibly be something that the teacher does as an individual, but what could be more closely related to the change idea as a whole that might lead to further refinement.
Thank you. We have more questions coming in. Can you please further explain what it means to have a team of diverse set of expertise in terms of who should be involved with the NIC?
Yes. So, I really like the way I like to think about it is who can bring a unique perspective or different angle to the problem at hand, and who could offer up a diverse set of potential ideas to how to resolve it. And when I say that, I mean researchers, for example, can be extremely helpful in helping you find evidence-based change ideas. Their perspective is unique. Teachers, practitioners often don't have the time to cull through the research to help determine what could be some possible solutions to your problem, and can help facilitate the process of looking at the problem. So it's good to have people that are very close to the problem, such as teachers that are in the classroom, but people that are also a little bit less sort of in the trenches is also helpful. And it really depends on the focus of your networked improvement community. If the content is math, you want to include math experts, but you might want to have someone on your data team that can support teachers in really ensuring that their measures that they're selecting are solid, and that they're going to give them the information that they need. So the more you can bring together a group of individuals with varying strengths and sets of expertise, the more solid your plan will be, and a better understanding you'll gain as to whether it's really leading you to get the outcomes that you're seeking for.
Okay, great. We've got more coming in. This is one we hear a lot. What's the difference between NICs and PLCs?
Really good question. And I think they share a lot of similarities. I would say probably the most distinguishing thing is that typically a PLC will have sort of a long-term focus on an immediate progression in achievement. So for example, they might say we want to increase proficiency in students. So let's look at data, either formative or summative assessment data. Let's look at a unit that's upcoming. Let's make sure that we understand where students are at. How do we shift instruction? So to me, it's sort of a broader and more long-term range way of thinking about improving student performance, and it's important. And oftentimes PLCs implement plan, do, study, act cycles when they're looking at a unit and maybe a formative assessment. What NICs really do is that imagine sort of a microscope that's really looking at something very, very specific in instruction that is contextualized to that individual's classroom. So again, taking the example I mentioned earlier, if we're looking at quality dialogue in solving, arguing, and evaluating, what specifically around instruction, not necessarily just content, but what instructional moves are we making? What are the structures involved in that? How are we tracking how those instructional moves are happening? So it's very much focused on the teacher moves in order to get the student behaviors that we're hoping to, that will then lead to, again, the impact the secondary primary drivers and then the aim. So it's a subtle difference, but it happens very quickly, and teachers change what they're doing almost immediately as far as how they're teaching, and part of it is content focused, but a lot of it is more so on shifting those instructional moves and sharing practices across not just their PLC team, but across other grade levels, across other content areas, and in some cases across districts, depending on the nature of the NIC. And I know that we're close to time, Dominique. And
we are at time, yeah.
And I just want to say that some of these questions we can address during the panel as well. We will have the opportunity to continue to answer some of these.
Yep, and please go ahead and keep putting those questions in the chat. We are recording them and consolidating them so that we can get back to them as we get to that panel discussion, or some that we can answer in the chat as well. I just want to let everybody know, I know there's a lot of questions at the beginning about access to the slides and the recordings. This will all be posted on the REL Midwest website once everything goes live. So, and we will also email links to everybody who registered. Okay, great. All right, thank you so much, Alyssa. So now we'd like to provide you with a little bit of context about the work that's been done in Minnesota and the networked improvement communities. So give you some background as well as walk you through the timeline of implementation. So in 2018, we partnered with stakeholders at the Minnesota Department of Education to develop a project to support the improvement specifically of graduation rates at alternative programs or state-approved alternative programs in Minnesota. So as you'll see on the slide, historically, graduation rates for SAPs, state-approved alternative programs, have fallen behind the graduation rates at traditional high schools. This also holds true as we look over 5- and 6-year cohorts. So this was identified as an area where the state of Minnesota really wanted us to put some effort as REL Midwest. In order to support growth in graduation rates at SAPs in Minnesota, REL Midwest worked in collaboration with MDE, Minnesota Department of Education, to develop and facilitate 2 networked improvement communities, or NICs. This project spanned over 3 years and includes pre and after the COVID-19 pandemic. As state approved, I'll answer some questions when we get to the question and answer, so sorry. So in year 1, we developed a NIC of state approved alternative programs in urban areas around Minneapolis and St. Paul that included 5 schools. In year 2, we continued that work with the NIC, and we also established a virtual NIC with rural schools, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about these NICs in a minute. And then we're now in year 3, where we're using a train the trainer model to support their capacity to continue the work after the REL Midwest facilitation is done. So these NICs were all driven by the same problem statement that was established by the NIC members in collaboration with REL Midwest facilitators. And the problem statement that they came up with was they are not successfully reshaping the habits, developing the life and academic skills, and teaching the knowledge that students need to achieve personal success. This problem statement drives the work of the NIC. The aim statement also drives the work of the NIC, and this was also agreed upon and established by NIC members to increase graduation rates in their schools by 20% over the 3 years. I did want to just quickly share that we had a highlight moment last year. So in February 2021, REL researchers shared that one of our NIC schools had actually seen a 27% increase in students completing more credits, putting them closer to graduation. So definitely seeing progress towards our aim statement, which is very exciting. So a little bit more context about our NICs. In year 1, we established what we called sort of this suburban urban NIC in the St. Paul, Minneapolis areas. It included 5 schools. You'll see their names up there on the screen. 5 administrators, 34 teachers, and the NIC sessions were all in person at that point. This was pre-COVID. In the first year, they focused on a goal-setting intervention that I'll share a little bit about in a few minutes, but also mindfulness and social and emotional learning interventions were priorities to meet their aim statement. In year 2, again, we continued on with the NIC schools. By this point, we had some attrition, so 2 schools participated, both administrators at the schools, and 1 school actually increased the number of teachers participating in the NIC, so rounded out to 13 teachers. This was all virtual this past year because of the COVID-19 pandemic environment. In this year, they continued to do goal-setting activity as well as scaffolding on another intervention or change idea called Sparks. I won't go into that today, but you can certainly look it up online. This was focused also on developing the capacity of these schools to continue to do Pdsa cycles. In the second year, simultaneously, my colleague Courtney Rowland led a virtual NIC of rural alternative learning programs and alternative learning centers. So there was 3 ALCs or ALPs that were part of this NIC that included 4 administrators, 9 teachers, and this was all virtual. However, this NIC was always planned to be virtual even before the COVID-19 pandemic, just to sort of make it easier for rural schools to participate. They didn't have to gather in person and spend that time traveling. They also focused on the goal-setting intervention and social and emotional learning. So we just wanted to share a little bit about the goal-setting intervention that both of these NICs used in their time with us. So this is an example of their change idea, their strategy of goal setting. Goal setting is an evidence-based practice. It's a strategy to improve student learning, improve student and teacher relationships, and clarify expectations for students and teachers, as well as promote development of a growth mindset for students. The strategy itself is student-driven, is focused on setting small, achievable academic goals or educational goals for students. It includes student and teacher discussion of the goals and reflection on their progress. And it also includes regular intervals where students reflect on their own process. This is a very simple yet very powerful intervention for students. It supports SEL, it supports clarification around goals and expectations for students and teachers, and fosters that growth mindset. The example that you see on your screen is actually just a tool that some of our schools use to help with the intervention. So I don't want to confuse anybody that the goal setting sheet you see in front of you is not the intervention, it was the process of goal setting itself. So now I'm going to turn it to Courtney to share some of our big takeaways.
Thanks, Dominique. Good afternoon, everybody. I am here to share some reflections and lessons learned from the virtual NIC that Dom just described. So this is the one that took place last year during the epic 2020-2021 school year. So we had, as Dominique said, 3 area learning centers from rural areas of Minnesota participating in this NIC. And our aim, just to give you a quick sense of what we were working on together, our aim focused on improving graduation rates, and more specifically for this context, which was an important adjustment that we made as a team up front, was improving rates of credit recovery, accrual, and completion. So that was the specific language in our aim. And then, as Dom said, we worked on goal setting as our change idea. So in a little bit, you're going to hear more specifics about this NIC when we open up the panel discussion with 2 of the participants. But in the meantime, what I want to share with you now, and what's on the screen here, is just some overall reflections and lessons learned that that we took away from the year-long experience. And these points are actually described in more detail in a blog that I think is going to be put in the chat box for you. So we wrote a blog post at the end of the NIC last year, and you can see more detail in that link. So these reflections represent some of the most salient things for us that emerged at the end of the year, but there's certainly a larger range of lessons learned and considerations when designing and implementing a NIC. These were just our main takeaways. So number 1 here, the first thing to share about is this idea of communicating and understanding NIC expectations up front. So I'm really going to get into the nuts and bolts of designing and implementing a NIC here. So I've learned, and I think this will resonate with others, that in improvement work that I've engaged in with schools or with districts or different teams, that it's really important to be concrete at the front end about what the work requires. So doing the rapid cycle testing of change ideas and using data to monitor progress in a disciplined way, the way that Alyssa described, it is a new way of doing work for many. And it requires time, and it sometimes requires a different sort of structure for how we collaborate and reflect than is what's currently available in the school day. So we have to sort of think about that differently. So I think that's why it's important to be clear about that up front, both for those that are doing the lift of the change idea, which is often teachers, and for the leaders in schools and school systems that need to sort of create and support and facilitate the space for these folks to engage in the work. So for example, you might show NIC participants really early on a draft of a Pdsa form and be clear about what a trial is and how often they will need to implement the change idea and collect data and reflect on it. Sort of being clear about these things up front is really, really vital. It might seem too in the weeds for early discussions when you're just pulling a NIC together, but I promise you, especially for busy teachers and school leaders and administrators, they sort of crave clarity right away about how is this going to look and how is this going to affect my work. So that's the first lesson learned that I wanted to share with you all. Second, the sort of center part of the slide, supporting the ideal conditions for a successful NIC is essential. We found in this particular NIC that teachers were more likely to engage in the process when school leaders, and this is sort of related to what I was saying a minute ago, when school leaders provided time and support for people to participate in the activities, including time for planning, time for collecting data with integrity and engaging in meaningful reflection. And having that kind of support and carved out time actually helps to sustain the Pdsa work even after, you know, like after REL has exited the situation, for example, REL Midwest. It makes it become sort of a way of doing work, which is an important transition in this. It can't feel like it's one more thing that is not integrated into the existing practices and strategies. So some of the other strategies we use to support ideal conditions, you can see the sub-bullets there, emphasize the importance of using evidence, not hunches, to inform decision-making, co-designing the improvement measures with the team, and sort of meeting NIC members where they're at when it comes to measurement, data collection, and data reflection. So for that first sub-bullet, and this is something that I think Brad and Alyssa really honed in on when we did our work together, the data collection part of the Pdsa work and looking over the data together in team meetings and conversations was sort of a game changer. And I think that's part of something we realized in our work. It can sometimes feel challenging because it's a new way of doing work, but with helpful tools and templates, it's important and a doable part of the process. We also found that co-designing the improvement measures was a helpful part of doing a NIC. So for example, we developed the language, you know, Alyssa was talking about those measurement tools or rubrics or exit tickets, different ways of doing practical measurement around the change ideas. We would design the language around those measurement tools with our NIC members to make it more, more aligned with the audience, more user-centered. And then last, I think it's okay to ease into this work. You know, we started our NIC, this virtual NIC by just doing the plan and do components with some light reflections at first, and then we strengthened the measurement and the study and act components over time. So real quickly, let me just say before we transition over to the, see if you have any questions and transition over to the panel. The final takeaway from our NIC, if you could just go back one slide, please, are really these notions of having a continuous learning mindset and cultivating and relying on relationships. This kind of work only happens when we have a continuous improvement mindset, both for ourselves and our own practice and for our students. So we have to believe and be open to this space for improvement. So I just wanted to wrap up with those takeaways and lessons learned from our virtual NIC. I'm sure Alyssa and Brad will share more during the panel, and you all may have similar additional takeaways from your improvement work. I think, Dom, do we have a couple minutes for some questions?
We do have a couple minutes.
Okay.
We have some questions for each of us. So I'll address a couple questions directed at my presentation. So what is a state-approved alternative program? This is something that exists in Minnesota. They have to be approved to meet the educational needs of these specific students. So it's just a technical term, but it's essentially alternative learning programs and centers that can work in very different ways, but serve the same population of students. Somebody asked for more information on goal setting. Goal setting is an evidence-based strategy in the What Works Clearinghouse, and there is actually a practice guide that lives on the What Works Clearinghouse website that I can try and chase down during this presentation for you. But that's a great strategy, been very effective for our schools for sure. And then Courtney, we have a question for you. And actually, I guess this could be for both of us. So in what ways did technology support data collection and data review across multiple members of the NIC? Do you want to go first with that one?
Sure, that's a good question. Here are a couple things that come to mind right away, Kim. So collecting the data can be burdensome sometimes. So we built an Excel spreadsheet with Alyssa and Brad and the other NIC members that they could use to quickly collect the data in the moment around the goal setting and document what they were getting. They use texting. They might tell you a little bit more about it to communicate with their students to implement the goal setting process and do some of their check-ins. We used Google Forms and would text the for the exit survey or the quick student survey, we would text the Google form directly to the students. So we had to sort of remove the frictions and remove the barriers to getting the data and getting it quickly and making it accessible to people. And so we used technology the best we could for that. And then one more thing I'll just say, because part of your question was around making meaning of the data or data analysis. Our team would often take the data that the schools would push out and create some tables and graphs and bring those to our Pdsa meetings so that we could sort of make sense of things together. So there are a lot of nice options for quickly creating charts and graphs that we would use to make sense of the practical measures data.
Mm-hmm. And our suburban NIC, similarly, especially during COVID, used some similar strategies as Courtney described, of having sort of like the quick surveys and exit tickets and things. We also would take time during our full network meetings to have teams share how they were doing data collection. We had some teams that came up with some pretty creative ways of automating data collection into like shared Google Drives or shared spreadsheets. So we made that a part of like that cross learning. And similar to, again, what Courtney said, like making a focus as a facilitator of really working with the teachers to figure out what is the best way for them to collect data in a way that fits into their daily work, and really makes it a practical measure to collect. And, you know, how do you integrate those systems better? So even as the Pdsa cycles, you know, keep going, you continue to refine those collection measures too, and figure out new ways to use data. Certainly during the pandemic, Jamboards were a big tool that we used in terms of data reflection, so that people could collaborate across schools and in different locations. Okay, I think we have time to answer one more question. So the work I'm doing with districts in need of assistance for SPP indicators, they weren't reaching out for support. My aim of doing this work is in a more meaningful way, leveraging staff knowledge, collaborating with them, and creating tools doesn't always work. There are contractual union parameters that makes it hard to collaborate. How do you make more of it with a NIC setup? I'll speak to that point quickly and then turn it over to you, Courtney, to respond as well. So often what we would do as facilitators is we would show them some examples that we would create, and then we'd all sort of reflect together. So we took on some of that work of development, but it was really like just to kind of shorten the time that we needed to spend on it. And then incorporating the sharing as we went, as they used the tools and started to develop them on their own. So it's kind of how we got around that time commitment thing. I think the time for collaboration is so important, and it's so fundamental in a NIC. It's part of what actually moves progress towards meeting that aim, is that opportunity to share. So I think any kind of work you can do as a facilitator sort of beforehand without really taking, you know, control away from the NIC, but adding those tools and giving them some ideas to reflect on rather than putting the onus on them to generate things from scratch. So that would be, I guess, my thoughts on it. Courtney?
Yeah, I'm hearing more in the question, the sort of how do I embed this in our work in a meaningful way without outside support. And, you know, it's interesting because in a couple of the projects that I'm working on now, we are trying to think about how this work sustains after, you know, outside groups like us exit. And some of the ideas that are on the table right now are finding the role in the system that can really be the owner of this work. There are lots of tools and resources and templates out there to find to sort of design it and customize it the way you might want to in your system, but having someone sort of own it in the work. So for us in one of our districts, it's going to be school leaders, teacher leaders, and instructional coaches. So they actually have continuous improvement work now embedded in their roles and responsibilities in order to carry some of these strategies forward as part of their day-to-day work. And I think it'll happen in the PLCs. So I think it's also about finding different ways to use PLC time that's more NIC focused. That's just a couple ideas that come to mind.
Great, thank you. And I think we're at time to move on. So Courtney, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. So we're going to spend our last half hour or so hearing from our panel and the two people that you probably want to hear from the most, Alyssa and Brad. Let me first just start by reintroducing them quickly as they come on camera here. Brad Jensen and Alyssa Prater are the lead advisors at the Empower Area Learning Center in Hinkley, Minnesota. Dom introduced them earlier. They are in eastern Minnesota, just a bit north of Minneapolis, I think I remember. And they serve, so just to give you a sense of what they do at Empower, they serve alternative program students from their school district and surrounding school districts by using flexible and innovative methods to educate non-traditional high school students, but still in a supportive and rigorous environment that prepares them for life beyond high school. So as we get into this panel, I'll have some questions for Brad and Alyssa directly, but I also want to welcome Dominique and Alicia to add their responses and comments as we get into the conversation. So welcome, Alyssa and Brad. If you can wave so everybody can see you on the screen amongst all the little boxes. There we go. Let's start with this first question here. Tell us a little bit about why you wanted to be a part of this networked improvement community and what you hoped to accomplish. So the call out comes across your email or you see it in a newsletter or something, and what triggered you to think this is some work that we want to engage in, and what were the goals that you were looking to achieve? So let's start with Brad first.
Wow. Okay. No. What I would say is that we are a program that is constantly looking for ways to improve the support we give our students. Since we are non-traditional, every student's doing their own thing. We really wanted any opportunity, like this opportunity came up where we could, how do you improve the graduation rates? And, you know, in our alternative world where you have a group of students who just don't fit into the high school, who have given up on high school, are maybe interested in coming back to high school. How do you take that three groups of individuals and how do you bring them together and help them go forward as a group? And so any way to improve our capabilities, I mean, we'll jump at it. You know, we're like fish and live bait. So that's kind of where we're at. Alyssa?
So as Brad mentioned earlier, we are part of a traditional school district. So we are a second high school within our school district. And so Brad and I are part of the high school teachers team. And anytime there is a PLC, it is geared towards your traditional first period through seventh period teaching model. And thankfully, our administrators have been very supportive and have allowed Brad and I to find different opportunities to create PLCs or learning opportunities that are much more appropriate to helping us and our students. So when this came across our desks, the biggest part for me was, yes, this will be some sort of professional development that actually can be applicable to alternative learning situations. So that would be the main reason why we sort of jumped at it. Plus, we are both involved in the Minnesota Association of Alternative Programs, where we get to network with other schools. And we know the positive things we've gotten out of that in the past. So the idea of getting to network with some people that we may or may not have met at various MAP events was exciting as well.
Great, thanks to you both. Let's switch over a bit to the content of our NIC. So we know we worked on goal setting, and that was decided sort of early in our NIC work together. We did a root cause analysis and a driver diagram. Can you tell a bit of a story to the listeners about how, because improvement work is so fine-grained sometimes, and we really made little little moves to your change idea over time. And maybe Alyssa, you can start here. Tell a little bit of a story about where did we start with the change idea and why, and then how did it sort of evolve or improve over time? What are little improvements we made?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that, because I literally just made a list of all of the different little minute changes and tweaks that we did so that I could remember. So every day, Brad and I start with an advisory, and we just circle up as a whole group. And one of the questions that we asked our students was, besides how are you? And the silly question of the day is, what is your plan for today? And we decided in our first meeting that we were going to change the word plan to academic goal. So that was it. That was our first tweak. So every day when we sit down, have advisory, it became, what is your academic goal for today? And we wanted to see if that made a difference for the students. Maybe they would, instead of answer, I'm going to sleep today, maybe they would look at it as, okay, I should be doing something academic. And then we added, and I might have these in a little bit out of order, but I know the things that we added. So then we just added an end of the day checkout. Did you meet your goal today? Did you not? Okay, great. Oh, no. Okay, we'll try again tomorrow. Eventually we added a midday check-in with reflection. So it was, are you on track for your goal? Are you not on track for your goal? And why or why not? Then we added, at the end of the day, we asked a little bit more detailed questions of reflection. And the midday check-in was more of an individual conversation with students, and the end of the day checkout was more of a group conversation. And we found the students really starting to encourage one another in those group conversations, cheering each other on, congratulating each other when they met their goals, things like that. And then ultimately we moved to actually doing a goal sheet that they filled out. But most of the year we didn't do any the students didn't do any writing of any goals. Brad and I just took notes on it, and then, noted whether they said yes or no and what their reflections were. And you had mentioned earlier the technology. The reason why we used the texting in this process is that last year our school was entirely hybrid. So I have an advisory of 10 students. Brad has an advisory of 10 students. Brad's students came in on Mondays and Tuesdays, and mine came in on Thursdays and Fridays. But in order to get counted as present for the days that they were remote learning, the students did have to communicate with us. And so I don't remember at what point in the process, but I started, instead of just saying, hey, are you out there today? I started texting, what is your academic goal for today? And started using that same language in my text communications with the students on their off days.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that's great. Anything I see we have a question there, but anything you want to add, Brad, before we go to this question in the chat box?
No, that was a pretty good roundup of how we proceeded.
Yeah. Well, it's a great question from Brian, and I was going to ask something similar about what kind of data did you collect? And so he's asking, this kind of specificity is really helpful. Thank you. How did you determine if these tweaks were working?
So we're pretty lucky in the fact that what we do is, as opposed to report cards or mid-quarter report cards, we give out every 2 weeks, a student and their parent or guardian get a progress report that shows the number of credits, what they've been working on, and the number of credits they've earned in that 2-week period. So we did two things. We took and we documented those students that participated in goal setting, and working with those that set goals and how many academic goals they set, how many academic goals they achieved, and how that reflected on their credit progress report. And so when we were collecting data, those are the areas that we really focused on. And and like you said before, you can do some improvement, but if you don't have a way of tracking it, and you don't have a good idea for tracking it or collecting data on it, you really won't know if you're improving. But having the NIC representatives give us this spreadsheet that allowed us to, who's writing goals, are they meeting their goals, and how is that impacting their progress as far as earning credits, that really brought a big flashlight to us. You know, it was more than a flashlight. It was like a nightlight. I mean, it just showed everything and how you could see the difference between students that weren't setting goals or weren't setting very good academic goals and their progress, and those students that were really engaged in the goal setting process and what they were doing academically as far as progress. So it really helped us document and show the necessity for being more specific in our goal setting routine.
Yep, that's great. Thanks, Brad. Nice comment from Amy here. I love that so much. Low stakes and minimizes the threat of the action as perceived by students who have not had big success. Yep. Essential part of continuous improvement work. One of the other things I noticed, and before we move on to the next question, since we're in this space of how did you know if things worked and what did the improvements look like? I remember that our conversations sort of would focus on two things: the logistics of how you would do it, like the routine itself, the timing, when you would do it, how often. So that was a part of it. And then the content of the prompt, or so your point earlier, Alyssa, about the types of language we use in the prompt or the content of the task that you ask. And those two things seem to marry to be your overall change idea and how you would talk about improvements around it. Does that resonate with you both?
Yeah. Can I add one thing to Amy's comment about the low stakes? One of the surprises for me about participating in this is, you know, when Brad and I went into it, we thought, what are we getting ourselves into? And one of the biggest pleasant surprises was for lack of a better way to say it, the small amount of work that we actually had to put in. And I don't mean to say that we didn't put in effort, but it was, all of the people that were there to support us did a really good job of saying, where are we? What are we working on now? And how can we make small, minute changes that, like we said, our students didn't even notice, really. They didn't know we were doing this. We talked about it, I think in April and May, we finally told them we'd been working on this all year long. And just the big impacts that we saw along the way for what felt like very intentional, but very small changes. So we could really see the big impact. We didn't feel like we had to overhaul our entire program.
Yep.
Great. Please continue to put questions in the chat, listeners. This is great. I'd like to open up Alicia and Dominique. Anything you'd like to add or ask at this point? If not, I can keep moving, but I wanted to make some space for the both of you if you needed to say anything.
I think just to build on what Alyssa had shared, thinking about grain size is just such an important part of the process, like those manageable chunks, not only for the students, but for the teachers who are, you know, making the changes. And that's what Pdsa cycles allow you to do, you know, take that tiny grain size and then build throughout the years. You continue Pdsa cycles, which I think just makes it so powerful.
And the only other thing I would add or emphasize about what Alyssa said is I think there was a question earlier in the presentation about how this is different than a PLC. And Alyssa just sort of described it as best as one can, in that there's certain restrictions, you know, in that kind of structure. But really, as I mentioned earlier, you could be thinking about a problem related to attendance, a problem related to discipline, an issue, really across any. It could be around engaging more families. It could be, so you can have all these different degrees and variations and issues that are really real, that are critical barriers. And you come together and you figure out what the root cause is to that specific issue. You engage a diverse set of individuals to help you think through it. And then you pick something that you're going to try, just the way Alyssa described it. And then you just make sure that it's tight as far as like, okay, this is what I'm gonna try, this is how I'm gonna know if it's gonna work. We're gonna come together, we're gonna talk about it. And so when Alyssa says, you know, the shift, when we were planning for this, we were laughing together because she was saying, you know, when I'd work with Courtney, she'd say, what's that small little shift that you're making but yet that small little sort of shift would really increase like the possibilities, and the change was pretty significant. So that's where I think, Alyssa, when you were saying like the effort seems minimal relative to the changes that I'm seeing. So I think that's sort of the appeal of being able to see those quick wins and really get buy-in from the individuals that really want to see the change happening a lot quicker than one would expect with more traditional improvement efforts.
And if I can build on that too, like also the time to plan and to really think through your plan is something like that's different about the approach to like thinking about implementation. Like, what do I need to set up? I know a lot of our Nik teachers are like, okay, so next time I'm going to set a calendar reminder because this seemed to be a critical element. You know, I need to set this up on my desk so that I don't, you know, forget about it in the chaos that becomes the day. Right. So that's also like such a great part of the Pdsa cycles and those little shifts.
Okay, let me ask you both, Brad and Alyssa. We'll start with Brad. What did you find to be the most challenging aspect of the Pdsa work or our Nik work together?
Probably the most challenging was keeping up on the actual data collection. So we would do the goal setting, we would do the texting, we'd get the information in, we would do the progress reports, we would do the chats with the students, the one-on-one kind of counseling with the students, but getting that onto that spreadsheet was probably the most challenging. Yeah, I would say that was making sure that we just took the time to say, oh, have you updated your spreadsheet yet? And that was nice working together in a small space that we do. We would be able to remind each other, you know, hey, have you updated your stuff yet? No, but thanks for a reminder, I'll update mine now. So that was the biggest thing.
Yep. How about you, Alyssa?
I would say that when we switched over from just having conversations with the students to having the students start to fill out the goal sheets, that was when we started to see a lot of pushback. And that was challenging for me to not get really frustrated by that, because I felt like everything up to that point had been just sort of like one success after another, and this snowball was rolling. And then that to me felt like we hit a wall, and I was like, oh no, did we just implode this entire process by, and I don't really know why that was. I don't know if it was in our approach or if it was just that it was springtime and the students were ready to be outside, or how that worked. But that was a struggle for me.
Can you say more about what the push, would they be specific in their pushback? And I'm asking because, you know, part of what's challenging about this improvement work and change ideas is, especially in education, is we rely on routines, right? Adults do and students do. And so we're trying to disrupt routines, I think, in a lot of ways with these. So, and that can be challenging. So that's what's driving my question. What kind of pushback? Was the writing?
I think that maybe writing it down made it more of an assignment or a have to, you know, or made it, you know, more like, oh, this is schoolwork. And I don't go to that kind of school. You guys don't give me assignments. You don't make me fill out worksheets. And so, you know, I find it funny that I could have the same conversation with a student throughout the day, and I could have filled out their goal sheet for them. But when we asked them to fill it out, they would be like, yeah, I'll get it to you later. Yeah. So.
And see, and that's like a person, you know, like the person who's got in the chat, 90 students. I mean, we deal with a small group with, you know, 24 students in our day program. And our culture is you work on your own thing, and we will help you develop, you know, what do you want to learn? How do you want to learn it, kind of thing. And then you come in, like Alyssa says, and you say, okay, you want to do what you want to do, but we have this task for you to do. It's like, whoa, this is not what I want to learn. This is what you want me to learn. So this is different. So it's, it's a whole different, we're trying to sneak in a whole different mindset for our students that are, wait a second, this isn't how we're set up here. And so, it's just how you got to couch it with them, and just, bring it back around to what they want to learn. And okay, this is what you're working on. How can we get you where you want to be working on that? And it took us some time to figure out how do we approach some of our students to make them feel comfortable doing something that they seen as additional work outside our focus is to get credits and graduate. Now you're telling me I've got to do this that has nothing to do with me getting credits and graduating, and explaining to them, in different terminology. Yes, it does have a lot to do with how you're going to graduate. This is a tool to help you, but you can't just come to our students and say, hey, we got this new thing, because they're going to back off and say, wait a second, this isn't something I picked. So yeah, it's kind of interesting. You develop a mindset, they take a hold of it and ownership of it, and then you slip in a change, and then it's like, whoa, wait.
Yeah.
If I can build on what Bradley just shared in the context that he painted for us, which I think is really important in this conversation, and it connects to a question in the chat regarding the number of students. I think there was also a previous question around implementation science, right? And how is implementation science embedded in this work? And I think the key thing is that we take a strategy like goal setting, which is an evidence-based practice, but under what conditions, with whom is that practice working, right? And it's going to look different based on the context that you're in, the students that you serve, the size of population. So I think that's sort of the beauty of the NIC, is that you can test what you know to be what the research says is an evidence-based strategy, but how do you apply it in your contextualized settings, right? And all those variabilities are what implementation science is about, right? Is really recognizing what are the different variabilities and what are the sources to those variabilities. Are they systemic, meaning are they policy barriers, resource barriers, or are they more at the individual level, meaning beliefs, behaviors, knowledge at the practitioner level? Or is it based on the context of your students, their needs, their all of that. So I think being able to refine something that large, like an evidence-based strategy, and chisel to it so much so that it works for your students, and then capture that so that you share it and disseminate it across settings that are like yours, but also dislike yours, so that you could say, well, that might not work for me, but how do I refine it so that it fits my context? And then that's where sort of the dissemination process unfolds, somewhat organically, but very methodically, in that there's evidence behind the success of that practice.
And just to build on that, to give an example from the NIC of exactly what you were talking about, Alyssa, some of our teachers who had sort of a larger population of students they were dealing with would identify a smaller group of students to test the idea in their implementation. And once they got that nailed down, they would scale it out to all of their students. So it was really about thinking about grain size and implementation, and then getting the implementation correct. And now it's, let's fit it to this broader context, but I've had some success here. I figured out what I need to do to kind of make it work with this smaller population of students. So that's just one specific example.
Great, thanks, Alicia and Dom. Looks like we have a question from Amy. This last part makes me wonder, is there a reason why you didn't tell students what you were doing? When I was in the classroom, I always said what I was doing and why, but is there a drawback to doing that in this process? Maybe because it alters the data. Any thoughts on that piece, Alyssa and Brad?
My first thought is just that we already always ask them, what is your plan for today? And so it was just a really easy place to switch that to what is your academic goal. And when I said we didn't tell them what we were doing, I mean, we don't usually tell the students all of the professional development that we do behind the scenes when they're not here. So I guess at the beginning, Brad and I looked at it more of, this is something that he and I are doing to improve our approach and our instruction with the students. And then we did eventually tell them, you know, that we were tracking the data. And but initially, I think it was like, oh, this is so simple. All we have to do is change 2 words and we can keep doing what we've been doing. And let's see if that makes a difference. I feel like, especially with alternative learners, like as Brad said, it takes them a while to get into the mindset of coming from a traditional 7-period-a-day high school where their teachers tell them what they're learning, when they're learning, how they're learning it, and when the assignment is due, to coming into our setting where we say, you don't have any due dates, you don't have any assignments, you actually have to tell us. If you want due dates and assignments, we'll help you build them, but it is very student directed here. And once you give them that autonomy and that agency, then anything that you might try to do to change their course, they will call you on it and they will buck at it. And you know, it's the plus and minus of working in the environment that we work in. And I would say overall, it's a big plus to have the students direct their own learning. But I guess I just didn't want them to feel like they were being manipulated in some way, when it didn't, to me, feel like a big manipulation. It was just a word choice change that we started with.
Yeah, and I think the big thing is that when we said we didn't tell the students what we were doing, we didn't tell them we were involved in a NIC process. We were developing, in our classroom all year, you know, we talked about goal setting. We talked about, you know, we talked about all these things, the pluses and minuses of, you know, setting good goals, setting bad goals, that, you know, so it wasn't like we kept that a secret. The thing we didn't let them know about was that we were involved in a data collection process. That was the thing that we thought that it really didn't matter to them. And we didn't want to skew the data by letting them think that, oh, if they're collecting data on this, I might want to change the way I'm acting because that will help them or hurt them with their data. We wanted to kind of neutralize that collection aspect.
That makes good sense. Okay, so we talked about the most challenging aspect of participating in the NIC. What would you say was one big success from having participated in this NIC? One big successful takeaway. Let's start with you, Brad.
Oh, shoot. Actually, I think the big success for us was long-term. We got so much as far as products out of it, and the products were just 2 sheets of paper, but developing that concept of weekly goals and daily goals with our students, the midday reflection, just the things that other schools were learning and could bring into the NIC, that helped us also. That collaboration outside of our school that the other 2 schools were able to bring in, and when we were talking to them and going over the process and going, oh, wow, you were having problems or had success in that area. I never thought to change it around that way, you know, and we were having difficulties here, and this is how we, you know, I think the biggest success was working with schools out other than ourselves and coming up and seeing different ways of implementing it. And then just the improvement, the validation of the process. You know, I went into this thinking goal setting, graduation rate, how is that really gonna, you know, I can get on a long horse about graduation rate, but it was, you know, goal setting just didn't seem, but by the end of the year, you got to thinking, you know, if you don't have goal setting, you know, it doesn't matter what they do in math or science or anything, you know, that is kind of for our students in the alternative world, that is the cornerstone that everything else builds off of. If they can't see small successes and build on those successes and goals, I mean, they are going to be continually just out there in the wilderness. But having them establish even small goals, you know, just showing up. Can you show up for 4 days in a row? Make that a goal for this week. And then can you actually pay attention for 30 minutes in a 7-hour day? Make that a goal for a week, you know, and just watch them build on success after success or recover from failure. I mean, those were the huge things that we pulled out of that.
I agree with Brad. The collaboration was huge. Just being able to talk in real time with other schools about them experiencing goal setting, but in a different way, in a different context, and how it worked. And I would also say, and of course, I can't say with 100% certainty, but this first quarter of this school year, we have seen amazing amounts of credit being earned by our students, like more than a full year's worth of credits already done by multiple students. And I can't help but think that that has something to do with that underlying routine that we built into place last year and talking about those academic goals. I know part of it is also being back in the building, you know, the 4 days a week instead of 2 days a week. And now they're with 20 peers to, you know, throughout the day instead of just 10, but it's still, I just have this sense that a lot of the success that we're seeing this year is a reflection of all of that time spent on this goal setting last year.
Yay.
Yeah, exactly.
That's terrific. All right, I know we only have a couple of minutes left before I'm going to pass over to Dominique to close us out, but I wanted to give you your last question here. What advice would you give to other schools or school districts who would like to try improvement science and the networked improvement community approach?
Do it 100%.
Yeah.
Do not hesitate. Like I said, I did worry at some point, is this going to be just another thing? But for us, it was a really good way to be connected with other schools similar to ours and get to have real-time conversations about what works and what doesn't work in our setting. So if you are a unique school that functions differently than maybe your neighboring schools or your neighboring districts, this would be a great way to collaborate with those people that you can't just, I mean, when you talked about rural, even our closest neighboring school is a minimum of 15, 20 miles, which I know it doesn't seem like a lot, but the schools that we participated with, if we would have tried to drive, there would have been like 4 hours, 5 hours, 6, 8 hours driving. So it was just a great way to really connect with people that we wouldn't normally be able to collaborate with.
Yeah. Go into it scared. But it's nice to deal with people who are working on the research side of it, because, you know, when you're down in the trenches every day, you know, that whole data collection thing is just like, really, do I, you know, and it's amazing to watch, you know, data collection and to get somebody who's an expert in the improvement process. So, you know, you can bring up this is what happened today kind of thing, and they can go, well, this is what you want to capture out of that. And it really helps, you know, the person on the ground who isn't experienced or doesn't have the expertise in the improvement science process. You know, you can bring your practical knowledge and they can overlay their expertise, and you can really come out with a really fine product in the end.
That's a great last set of words there from you both. So I'm going to pass it over to Dominique to close us out, but I just want to say thank you, especially to Brad and Alyssa. I super enjoyed working with you on the NIC, and I think you're such a model as educators and as continuous improvement advocates. So take it away, Dom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for participating in that. Lots of great questions in the chat, too. Unfortunately, we are pretty much out of time, but I wanted to share some resources with you. Again, we will post this as soon as it goes live on the REL Midwest website. We will email the slide deck to everybody who is registered. You see here, there's a couple of reports. There's also a documentary on the first year of the NIC. There's slides from coaching sessions to be used as resources if you want to engage in this work yourself. and also a webpage that contains a facilitator's guide. So please go to the REL Midwest website and check it out. We've been posting the survey link in the chat box, so please take a couple minutes, help us out, make us, make these events even better. We'd love to hear your feedback and your questions and your comments. And it will also automatically pop up when you close your Zoom web form. Okay, we are offering certificates of participation for this. Please email Mia. You can see the in the chat box and on the screen, the email there. Sign up for a newsletter to get posts about events like these, and then follow us on Twitter as well. You'll get all of our events and special blogs and videos and things. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us.